Hey everyone, this is Mark Treichel with another episode of With Flying Colors. Today we have a topic that we've referred to in a lot of past podcasts. We've referred to in a lot of discussions with credit unions and our clients. And I'm excited again to be back with Todd Miller and Steve Farrar of my team, and also formerly of NCUA. Guys, how you doing today?
Enjoying
Doing
the fall,
well.
enjoying the fall.
Very good, very good. And just in case we have new listeners today who are listening to With Flying Colors for the first time, why don't you give a little bit of your background? Todd, we'll start with you.
Okay. I was with NCUA for 34 years. During that time, I can probably break my career into three pieces, about a third of it as an examiner and a problem case officer, a third of it as a regional capital market specialist, and a third of it as a director of special actions, supervising problem case officers, capital market specialists, regional lending specialists. Very enjoyable career. Most of it, even my time as a capital market specialist, spent a lot of it dealing with troubled credit unions. At the heart of troubled credit unions is corporate governance issues. So today will be a fun topic to talk about.
Indeed. And Steve, your background.
Yeah, as more specific to this topic, I'll address it. And my career was also in two parts. The first 15 years was out in the field as a problem case officer, and then the second part was 15 years in the central office. In the field, though, I got to work with troubled credit unions, and it would be funny. We'd come into the ones that poor corporate governance is why they ended up being in a problem case. And we did have Todd and I worked together on that, and we have a large number of credit unions we worked with that were extremely troubled that are turned around and are still in existence today. And I think that you don't see a lot of those turnarounds being quite as successful today as they were then. So it's even more important to not end up in that situation that the ones that we were able to turn around happen. Then in the central office, I got to be involved in a lot of the policy development and our efforts where we would be trying to provide guidance to credit unions on the issues that were upcoming. I think that'll be helpful as we go through this subject.
Very good. Yeah. And we used to be able to help credit unions before prompt corrective action and utilizing whether it was 208 assistance to actually allow capital to go negative. When prompt corrective action came around, that challenged the ability sometimes to work with institutions a little bit more freely. So while it was a rule that other banking regulators had and it made sense theoretically to give it to credit unions, it did take away some of the flexibility. So corporate governance, we've been seeing it a lot in exam reports. We've been talking about it in references to, Code 4, Code 5 podcasts, which we recently did. But how would you guys define corporate governance? Why don't we start there?
If you Google a definition for corporate governance, you'll get 720,000 results. So there's a lot of variations on this definition. I think what we'll use is the FDIC has one that is more institution specific. Maybe we'll use that one as a starting point. From the FDIC, they say corporate governance is a set of processes, custom policies, and laws affecting the way a corporation is directed, administered, controlled, how it manages risk, ensures compliance with laws and regulations, including consumer protection laws and regulations and the Community Reinvestment Act, not applicable to credit unions. Corporate governance also includes the relationships among the many stakeholders involved and the corporation's goals. It's a comprehensive one. But basically, when you summarize all these definitions down and compare them all, it's basically a structure of rules, practices, and processes. You could actually distill that down to corporate culture, which is really what a board is responsible for, is that corporate culture. As we both, Steve and I, alluded to, poor corporate governance, it often leads to the failure of an organization. I don't know how many times when we go into a problem case and we'd sit down and lay out the issues for the boards would just say, I was totally unaware. And along those lines, though, as Steve said, we fixed a lot of them. I think we should maybe throw a shout out there to all these corporate directors and credit union directors. Those men and women, they devote a lot of time. Most of them are unpaid, with a few exceptions in the minor states. And by and large, they're very dedicated and they do a very good job of keeping our system safe and sound. And I was always surprised in troubled credit unions when we tell credit unions boards and they'd say, hey, we didn't know what was going on. They didn't resign and walk away. They always stayed there to help fix it. And that always amazed me over my career, their dedication to restore their institution to good health.
Great points there. Steve, any thoughts on what Todd had to say there?
Yeah, I tried to, what's the simplest way to break down what you're trying to do with corporate governance is I came up with being proactive, smarter risk taking, and one that is near and dear to my heart is ethical standards. Is Todd and I can tell you that some of the ones that where the board members probably weren't part of the solution were places we went into with really poor ethical standards. That was always the most frustrating one because it's greed takes hold in some of these cases and it can make people do really poor decisions.
Great points by all of you there. I'm gonna highlight a couple things. The shout out to those who serve. Great point, Todd, with the fact that people don't walk away. A, the fact that they're there to begin with, but B, that when it gets tough, they circle the wagons and strive to make it work. On the ethical standards side, I can think of cases where I was involved, and I can think of client situations where, for example, there were write-offs that had to happen, whether it was accounting issues or conversion issues. And what happens with NCUA when there's a write-off like that, is NCUA thinks, is there an ethical issue, right? Were these write-offs legitimate write-offs and errors, or did somebody benefit from it? And we've seen that over the last couple of years. We've seen that during our career where there was fraud or there was just situations because of the quality of the books and records. There was the opportunity for fraud, and that can get NCUA hyper-focused. Whether or not it was fraud or not, the fact that there's a write-off gets NCUA really focused on what happened there. Were there ethical challenges, et cetera? And then Todd, you mentioned in that definition from the FDIC side, Community Reinvestment Act, and it doesn't apply to credit unions. There are some rumblings from NCUA's chairman, Todd Harper, who was asking on LinkedIn if CRA should be expanded for credit unions. That triggered a letter from the Defense Council, BCUC Trade Association saying, no, there shouldn't be. It was the first time I commented on a post by an NCUA board member since I left. I said, no, you don't need a Community Reinvestment Act because you have the ability through the modest means requirement of the Federal Credit Union Act to do whatever you need regulatory and guidance wise. So I've got a podcast queued up for that topic coming out. And so that's just a heads up to that. But hopefully that doesn't get any legs because it would just be another burden for credit unions. Any comments relative to my response to where we're at on the definition and those things?
No, I think we'll expand on this as we go.
You got it. You got it.
So, maybe a good place to start here now is maybe let people know where's some resources for credit union directors. Say you're a new director or you're a board and you've done a self-assessment and you're trying to figure out our way forward. How can we improve? There are various resources out there. In many cases, NCUA might not be your best one, but NCUA does have some resources. First off, they actually lay out the director's responsibility in the rules and regulations. It's in 701.4. And just by regulations, the directors are supposed to have the general direction and control of the credit union. They may delegate a lot of operation functions. They let management implement a lot of the policies, but ultimate responsibility for each credit union's board is that they're in charge. They have direction. They have control of the credit union, and that general direction and control in the regulation says that's non-delegatable. They don't get to foster that off on their management. So in the regulation, it lays out some things. It expects that credit unions carry out their duties as a director in good faith. They expect them to be fair and impartial without discrimination to any one group of members over another group of members. There's an expectation for some board basic financial training in NCUA's and then the regulation expects them to direct the operations of the credit union in conformity with the law. The act, their bylaws, this regulation, and they have this catch-all phrase in there, sound business practices, which they don't really define anywhere. So that's a somewhat interesting piece. When you go beyond that, NCUA actually has very little in specific resources for credit unions. They have some stuff in the exam guide that talks about a director's responsibilities and board and committee minutes. They have a flag in their exam guide that there's an upcoming and under development chapter for directors. At one time, NCUA used to publish a handbook for directors or board members, little blue handbook. That doesn't exist. It's not on their website anymore. They probably haven't updated it since it was done a long time ago. But other than that, NCUA doesn't have a lot of specific resources specific to board governance. They do for some corporate credit unions if you dig through some old corporate letters. But in general, you have to infer what NCUA's expectation for board members are from that regulation and from their bodies and letters to credit unions, which cover specific topics. There's not really one out there that talks about general board governance. So what I would suggest for credit unions is you go look at the FDIC and the other regulators. The FDIC does have a pocket guide for directors. It's 6-7 pages, maybe a little bit shorter, depending on how big of a font you make your internet page when you print it out. They keep it updated. It's done very well. Back in 2016, they did a supervisory insight. So they did a really longer commentary on that supervisory guide or on that pocket guide for directors. It's actually really good. It's not a very long read either, only 10-15 pages. And then something unusual, and we'll let Steve talk about this because he's an expert on it. The FDIC actually has proposed guidance. I don't know if the comment period is closed on it or not, on corporate governance for larger institutions. So as you start getting more complex, if you look through all the corporate governance literature, it will always say your system should be commensurate with your size and complexity. You don't need to have a perfect thing in a small credit union, but as you get larger and more complex, the duties of your directors become more involved. And those internal controls and those risk management structures and that strategic planning, it all has to change as you grow in size. But this proposed guidance that the FDIC has issued for larger institutions, it's a good guidance to give you an idea of where you might want to be as you grow larger and expand in size and complexity.
One other tool that I mentioned that came across as we were doing research on this that FDIC has out there is they have a YouTube video that's on corporate governance. So you can just go into YouTube and type FDIC corporate governance, they'll bring it up. It's a good introduction, I would say, for a board member. In a half hour, brings them through, an overview of corporate governance. And it might be something that somebody after listening to this podcast might want to look at because it give you a half hour or some more tools. So you could want to take if you're going to discuss it with your board members. But one more resource that was unique out there.
And I'll put links to all of those. Sadly, most of the links will be to FDIC. As Todd kind of summarized, there's not a lot out there from NCUA. And by the way, Steve, I did see you sent me that YouTube video. I've converted that into a podcast for the sister podcast, the Credit Union Guidance, and I put FDIC guidance on there as well. I downloaded that, turned it into an MP3, and it'll come out, I think, next month on our other podcast, Credit Union Regulatory Guidance, in the voice of NC, with an intro from Samantha Shares and in the voice of those folks on NCUA. So if someone likes audiobook style, that'll be out there soon. It's interesting with it, maybe not interesting, might not be the best word, but it's with the frequency that we're seeing corporate governance referred to in our conversations with credit unions that they're having with NCUA, for there to be this big blind spot in guidance from NCUA, because as we've talked about, if you have a problem in topic A, B, C, D, E, F, Z, it seems to be linked to corporate governance from NCUA these days. And it's an area where hopefully they'll catch up with the FDIC and have some guidance coming out relative to that. But that's more of an editorial comment. As far as the best document that's out there seems to be this FDIC proposed rule, which I think, if I remember, the comments are due to FDIC by December. So they're still taking comments.
It was probably December of last year because it came out 1 year ago in October of 2013. So I think your chance for comment is well past on that.
Very good. They still haven't approved it yet. So
they haven't moved forward on it. And I think that's being affected by things that are not necessarily related to the policy itself.
Got it. Very good. And Steve, with that, you've read this guidance from FDIC, I think, much more than Todd and I have. We've made reference to it, but why don't you give us our take on the pros of that guidance from FDIC and what credit unions might be able to take from it?
Yeah, I get kick. Todd accuses me of carrying this around in my back pocket because it's I refer to it pretty constantly. And while it is just proposed guidance for credit unions over 10 billion or more, it is a great document. It outlines, and we'll go through the outline, all the parts of a good corporate management, and explains. We talked about that it's important because of failures. But they note in this proposed rule that the failure of Signature Bank found that the root cause of failure was poor management without adequate risk management practices and controls, and the same at Silicon Bank. Their big losses, they directly attributed to this poor corporate governance. I'll go through and hit the kind of the outline of the rule under corporate governance. I like that it starts with the board of directors general obligations, as Todd talked about, that the board is ultimately responsible for complying with, as Todd pointed out, governing laws. And here's an issue that we've discussed about you have to look at the board composition. And it is important as your credit union is a bigger and maybe your field of membership becomes more broad, that the board is looking at what kind of skills are they looking for and need to have a well-rounded board with the right professional knowledge to be able to work through all of these issues. And I think that's an issue that's passed on a lot. I'll ask if you guys have any comments on the importance of that board composition.
I have some thoughts, but Todd, let's hear if you have any first.
I have a good story about that. It's interesting. You mentioned Signature Bank, but if you look at NCUA's postmortems, they're almost all board governance and board failures too. But in board comp, it's important that you have diversity of skills on there and diversity of backgrounds. I had a troubled credit union one time in California, but every director was a retired teacher in their 60s or 70s. And you start looking at their services, and it's just that's another thing you find in troubled credit unions is you're generally a breakdown in services. And you start mentioning things to the board that really the way you guys are offering services to your members, it doesn't fit your membership demographic. Basically, all the policies, fees, everything were skewed to retired people. And it never hit home for the board. They said that wasn't applicable to us. They yelled at me when I told them that. But we come back 3 months later and the director just says, "Hey, thanks for bringing it up." He said, "I opened accounts for all my grandkids and they all closed them because our service was terrible." And it took that to get the directors to get off their stools. But you do just need to be aware of that. Diversity amongst your directors is a strength. You can create blind spots in your board if everyone is from that same exact demographic and in background. So those skills are necessary, but varied demographics and different points of view are important to be on that board as well.
That's a great comment. And that reminds me of one of my favorite books, The Wisdom of Crowds, which I've referred to here a lot. But you have those blind spots if you don't have the diversity of thought. Todd, you said the diversity of skills. And then, of course, just the diversity for different minority groups. And I'll take this as an opportunity to refer to NCUA's proposed rule on succession planning, which requires many things, which will likely require many things as it relates to key positions and succession planning, including diversity. They actually tiptoe into diversity, and they include the board as key positions, which makes sense. Now, of course, we wrote a comment letter on that, and all three of us believe that guidance would be more appropriate than regulations. But be that as it may, I think by the end of the year, NCUA will probably have that rule in place, and credit unions should watch that and look to see what the diversity requirements are there. And it does make sense to have a diverse board in all of those areas so that you don't have those blind spots. Any other thoughts on that, or do we want to jump to the next major category of this proposed guidance?
I'll go ahead and move us forward. The next one is a big area here. It talks about and lays out that as it sees in terms of corporate governance, the duties of the board. And number one is great. Set an appropriate tone. That corporate culture is a big deal. I mean, Todd, we've talked about the problems and the ones that failed. It did start at the top and resonated through. So yeah, we all probably have things that we could mention real quickly about that setting appropriate tone. More in how did any of our places change from the inappropriate tone at the top to corrected corporate culture.
Thoughts on what Steve had to say there?
That tone from the top, it starts from the directors. A lot of times it gets heavily influenced by executive management. I don't want to take Steve's thunder away. The biggest responsibility of a board is to pick their management team, their CEO, and they need to keep that whole culture in mind and not pick a CEO that's going to dominate and determine that culture. It needs to come from the board. And this is one of those things where the board is independent. They still have to work very cooperatively with their management team, but they got to keep that independence. And it's important that board set the tone. And a lot of boards some are really good at it and some just do it informally and they don't even realize they're doing it. And that's when you get those breakdowns.
Now, that's a great point. I think about my time at NCUA and different boards that set the tone differently. And of course, I had the ability as executive director or deputy executive director to set my own tone in my conversations with staff. And I look back to when I was deputy executive director and versus 15, 20 years later when I was the executive director, and just the importance of when you meet people on the elevator and instilling in them the confidence of what's going on. And I might have been having a bad day on the 7th floor at NCUA, but it was important for that to stay on the 7th floor and for the discussions with staff to be focused and be positive and be ethically driven, which we're going to get to, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, the tone from the top, it's easy to lose sight of that as you're busy getting things done, but it really needs to be ever present in the mind of the board, in the mind of the executives, and the mind of the tellers as they're dealing, because it trickles down. While they're not at the top, it trickles from the top to the middle, to the front line, and to the members, which is why it's so important.
Yeah, and one other way that NCUA can dramatically change the tone that's at the top is through conservatorship. I was involved in a large credit union in New York that NCUA conserved, and it was really because of poor corporate governance and that we brought in a huge new management team. And that was our number one goal, is to change the tone that the employees are getting from the top, that it was not going to be, the business was not going to be done as it had been before. All right, now the other important one moving on is approve a strategic plan for the covered institution. That's the strategic plan is if you start working with us, one of the first things we'll ask for is your strategic plan. So we want to know where you think you're going and what tool you're going to use to hold management accountable. It has some points in here for strategic plan, articulate an overall mission statement and strategic objectives, to contain a comprehensive assessment of risks that currently affect the covered institution, explain how the covered institution will update as necessary its risk management program, and explain how the covered program will review, update, and approve the strategic plan as necessary. So that's just a drop in the bucket on strategic plan, which could be a whole topic for a whole separate podcast. But just to how that affects corporate governance. I'll throw that out there.
I can break that down into 3 questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? I always thought it was interesting in really high performing credit unions. You could go talk to the little tellers in the lobby and the loan officers, and they had a pretty good idea exactly what was in that strategic plan and their roles in it. And it's just something you notice in high performing credit unions, that whole culture and that whole plan is communicated all the way down from the board to management to staff executing it on a day-to-day basis. You just see that over in high performing organizations.
And I can think of some client conversations we've had where NCUA was critical of their strategic plan. And what seemed to have been driving it in most instances was their strategic plan said we're going to do A, B, and C. And then what they did was B, X, and Y. And there was not a lot of discussion about that pivot. So the credit union had what they perceived to be a good opportunity that wasn't in the strategic plan, and which may or may not have been the case, but there was not a lot of indications in the credit union's records that was something that was fully vetted with the board, and there wasn't an addendum to the strategic plan, there wasn't a big discussion in the board minutes, et cetera, which goes back to the board being ultimately responsible. And we've seen some situations where pivots were made from the strategic plan that weren't properly at least documented in making sure that it was clear that the board wanted to go in that direction. And the board saying it after the fact doesn't cut mustard with NCUA because they view that as cleaning up the record as opposed to establishing a record.
We have experienced some disagreements between credit unions and NCUA as to what kind of how long of an outlook should the strategic plan have. Most of our research has come up with 3 to 5 years is the general recommendation on the length of time you should be doing your strategic plan.
That's a great point. And if you look at how NCUA does it, it's a 5-year strategic plan, which may be updated sooner than that if there's a change in the presidency of the United States, because that means there's a change at the board level. But they also then do an annual plan that pivots a little bit. So here's the big strategic plan, and then annually they'll revisit it. And I always thought that was a pretty good way for NCUA to do it. And if a credit union has a 3 to 5 year strategic plan, they should be looking at it obviously annually when they're doing their budget, et cetera, maybe tweak it a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily have to go back to that bigger plan.
I had one credit union, a very troubled one that became a very high performer under new management. They actually had a policy on these kind of one-off things like this, these new opportunities come up. And it dictated, here's the business case that we're going to make and present to the board when these opportunities come up that we didn't think about in their strategic plan. And it was a whole risk assessment and a formal listing of here's what you bring to the board if we're going to do something that's outside our plan because we have a new opportunity that comes up, the world changes, business condition changes. But they had a formal process to deal with those one-offs and get them before the board and to make modifications as business opportunities presented themselves.
I like that. What's next, Steve?
The one that we probably don't need to spend much time on because it's just pretty self-explanatory. Approved policies. The board is responsible for establishing and approving the policies that govern and guide the operations of the covered institution in accordance with its risk profile and as required by law and regulation. I think that topic is pretty self-explanatory. We all have experience with good policy and lackadaisical policies, for lack of a better word.
On that topic, NCUA, here's a kudos to NCUA, which I don't always give out as frequently as saying something's missing, like not having good corporate governance. They do have a page that lists what policies are recommended, what policies are required with references to those citations, et cetera. And that was over the last year and a half, one of the better things I saw NCUA put out on their website. I think I turned it into a PDF, and I'll put that in a link to that in the show notes as well.
It also does a good job of saying how often boards should review them. General guidance to boards is review as necessary, but in NCUA, most of the financial regulators, there's various policies that are required to be reviewed annually. Others not so much. In that resource page that you mentioned, it does actually list out which ones are required by law to be reviewed annually. So good resource for your board calendar.
Very good. Very good. All right, next up.
Number 4, establish a code of ethics. The board should establish a written code of ethics for a covered institution covering directors, management, employees, and in addressing, conflicts of interest, self-dealing, how to report illegal and unethical behavior. And so employees know, who it is that they would need to go to. Having just a platform there so employees know that there is a program there and that it's found to be important by both the board of directors and senior management.
Todd, any thoughts on that?
It's just super important. A lot of the bonding companies actually require you have fraud policies and ethics policies for employees and directors. It's something that every organization needs. Now, you just need that enforcement mechanism because, like Steve said, people that operate outside those bounds of ethics create problems more often than not.
As we're talking through this one, how to report it, a light bulb went on. I think we all had this situation when we were examiners where we did our loan sample and we said we want these 25 loans. And then when the stack came, there weren't 25, there were 27, right? And there were two other loans that they thought we should look at. You recall any situations there? And of course, there's a direct link to ethics probably. If they're saying you might want to look at these, there might be some ethical situations. It could have been a board member that got favoritism. It could have been a staff member, or it could have been, in some instances, fraud, right?
Yeah, I had a similar thing happen in a credit union. So they were missing a lot of loans on their commercial loan appraisals. They were missing appraisals, and an employee just comes in and puts a jump drive on our desk. You might want to see this, and it's appraisals for all these properties that they tell us they don't have, and of course they're significantly valued under the loan balance. That credit union ended up in conservatorship.
Wonderful. Yeah, those conservatorship war stories tend to pop back into your mind in good and bad ways as we think back on the history of our time at NCUA. Very good. What's up next, Steve?
Provide active oversight of management. The board should hold management accountable for adhering to the strategic plan and approved policies and procedures to ensure the covered institutions compliance with safe and sound banking practices and all applicable laws and regulations. This is the one that we've been seeing a bit as comments on unhappiness with the evaluation process that the board's doing with senior management. You need to have that strategic plan so that they know what you're holding their feet to, but you need to hold professional management accountable, and that strategic plan and those directions that you provide allow you to do that. But you need to make this process appropriately rigorous.
Appropriately rigorous. I like that. Todd, any thoughts on this?
It's a huge one. So many times we get into trouble with credit unions. Directors need to be independent, but they still need to work cooperatively with management. And often what is they let management take over, that supervision of management isn't there, that appraisal of management isn't there. Management reporting leaves the board in the dark. So the credit union board hasn't set up appropriate controls. It's especially issues, it seems like, in smaller rural areas where rather than the board hiring the CEO, you have the CEO recruiting all the directors. And there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes that whole relationship gets skewed, and that's quite often can lead to problems. So I think probably the most important role a board has is hiring appropriate management to carry out the day-to-day operations of the credit union and supervise them appropriately. And that means a very rigorous, as Steve said, appraisal process. And this is probably a topic for a separate podcast, but it requires a reporting process where management is demonstrating compliance with all those board directives and policies.
Great point. And it also reminds me of when it goes awry, sometimes you'll see NCUA ask for an organizational review. We recently had a podcast on what to do if NCUA requires an organizational review. And I believe that might have actually been this week, this past Monday's episode. But that can be something when NCUA is not comfortable with how involved the board is, how they're appraising staff, et cetera, that you might get that dropped into your examination report.
Which is actually, so we've already covered the next topic, which is good because it's select and appoint that qualified executive officers. And so we've got that one covered quite well, and we understand the importance of that.
Very good.
The next one is provide ongoing training to directors. And I think that's is important because things move pretty fast. So it is a challenge because people are now developing enterprise risk management things. And so is your board properly have enough background to where they could evaluate and be a participant in that? So those types of issues are coming up.
I think an important piece of that too is good boards are going to do a self-assessment of where they're at and figure out that training plan. And I'll just go back to something we said in the beginning. NCUA's regulation actually has a bullet point on board training in the regulation. It's directed for new board members, but the ongoing training is super important in this day and age.
And there's a cast from a couple of years ago where I interviewed the CEO of Quantum Governance, who does a lot of training for America's credit unions and other groups, other trade associations. And I've seen their work at some credit unions, and they're very passionate about this whole governance topic. So that if you're a board looking to do some of that training and you're looking for somebody who might be able to do it, you might want to listen to that podcast, see if they're a good fit for you. All right, Steve, what's next?
Self-assessment. The board should conduct an annual self-assessment evaluating its effectiveness in meeting the standards of the guidelines that are in their risk management program.
That's pretty self-explanatory. Todd, any thoughts to add on that?
I already mentioned it, and I didn't mean to take Steve's thunder away. I don't have the document open. It was just a comment I threw out there just in line with that board training. But yes, it is important, and high-performing boards do that.
Very good.
And the last item under board responsibilities, and this is a big one, is compensation and performance management programs. Compensation is a big issue in how that's structured. One thing that has to always be taken in place is your compensation structure resulting in changing your risk profile, because it's focused too much on growth, or it's focused too much on a growth in a particular type of loan. And so in trying to meet that part of what's put in the strategic plan, is that causing you to deviate from your risk appetite that you think you have? The structure of your compensation program is something that needs to be done with care.
Great point. Todd, any thoughts on that one?
Part of that is also your performance management. So it's not only important for the board to be doing that performance appraisal of that CEO, it's important that they have a good system in place for that, so that occurs throughout the organization. It does have specific regulations on compensations, lending people specifically don't get incentives to increase risk. It doesn't come up very often. NCUA does have a regulation buried away that if you're a troubled credit union, you can't be changing your golden parachutes. Compensation is a difficult thing for directors because you want to pay your executives fairly to retain good talent, but you also don't want to get to the point where you're overcompensating them and being overly generous either. So it's a big challenge for directors. A lot of them use outside consultants to guide them along that process if they don't have directors with specific experience in that area, because it's very important. It's part of that corporate culture.
Great point. And as you're walking through that, it reminds me of NCUA's succession planning rule, the presentations they've made, the comments they've made relative to that, where they're talking about looking forward. You may see that smaller institutions aren't compensating their staff enough for what actually needs to happen. However, the pivot from that, NCUA is attacking their ability to continue to utilize appropriate, in my opinion, what are appropriate fee structures. So while at the same time they're saying you need to do succession planning and look at compensation and make sure they're stated that they're putting these smaller institutions that are already having difficulty making a profit in harm's way by making it more challenging to have some levels of fees, which I think is going to lead to increased mergers in that arena. But I digress. All right. Wow. Anything else? Anything we missed here relative? Obviously, there's a lot we missed because, like we said, you could take a month-long class on corporate governance. But anything else we want to highlight here today, gentlemen?
I think one thing that we're not going to go into on here that is in this proposed rule of NCUA, it has a lot of focus on the role of audit and internal audit, which for us, I think makes it appropriate for a separate podcast subject, but you can't. That is a tool that the board of directors has their ability to make sure that in helping hold professional management accountable, provided that they appropriately control that function.
And you said NCUA, but I think you meant FDIC, the proposed rule.
Yeah, proposed rule.
Okay. Or at least I thought I heard that. And as you mentioned that, one thing that popped into my head was the three lines of defense as it relates to this. Any thoughts on the three lines of defense relative to what we've seen where NCUA has been dealing with internal audit and enterprise risk management in some of the bigger institutions that we've been associated with, or any general thoughts on that?
Go through how you're defining the three lines of defense there, Mark.
So the frontline units who are responsible for managing risk in their business areas, independent risk management, which would be overseeing risk-taking activities across the credit union, and then internal audit, which ensures compliance with the risk management program.
Okay.
Outside, it's interesting. This goes back to NCUA's guidance. I don't know what year it was. Ms. Matz was a chairman. They wrote a letter to credit unions. ERM isn't required. This whole second line of defense, chief risk officer, that actually is under the whole realm of enterprise risk management, just by definition. We're seeing it more in credit unions. They require it of once type credit unions. It's a requirement for corporate credit unions. There is a letter to corporate credit unions about it. But it's not required for many credit unions. That said, when I was a director of special actions, I got a troubled credit union over $1 billion assigned to me. They weren't leaving me until they were down the road to implementing an enterprise risk management program. I've just seen real world successes through the last recession, the natural person credit unions in the Sand States and California and stuff. They performed admirably through that last recession. I know these enterprise risk management systems are extremely effective. They're probably a topic for another podcast. But like me, there was never NCUA guidance that said a credit union had to do it. I just, as a supervisor, said, you're going to do it because that's where sound business practice takes you. But we're seeing that from other examiners at NCUA too, even though there's not a requirement for it in these credit unions outside of ones and outside the corporate credit unions. We are seeing examiners put doors in place at much, much smaller organizations that says, this is what you need. And realistically, for directors, you start crossing that $1 billion path, you need to go down that road to ERM. It's going to become a business necessity, and you will have blind spots in your organization, and your performance will suffer if you don't put those types of risk management tools in place. That's one person's opinion.
Great. I would agree with that. That's a great summary and a great point. All right, guys. As always, this was fun. It brought up some past war stories. I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I think we referred to other subcategories that we might put on our list for future podcasts. Thanks so much for your time today, guys.
Take care.
And listeners, I want to thank you for listening. As always, I hope you'll listen again soon. This is Mark Treichel signing off with flying colors.